Now, there's a couple of different ways that Donald Trump could end his term. One is it goes the whole 4 years and then he loses re-election. Of course, it can go 8 years and then he would step down. 8 years, 4 years, that's a good one. Okay, he's not gonna make it. So if he's not gonna make it, there are only two paths for him to leave, impeachment and resignation. Wait, there's actually a third. So impeachment is the one that is most often talked about. Resignation could come for a number of reasons, mainly because you're worried they're gonna impeach you. But the third path is the 25th Amendment. If you are mentally incompetent to carry on the duties of the office, the vice president combined with majorities in Congress can have you removed. Now, some scholars say that it is a very, very high standard, meaning you don't pretty much have to be in a coma. Others say, no, that's not the case at all. We would just have to be absolutely sure that he is literally mentally incompetent to hold office, not meaning that we think he's dumb. That's a fairly easy case to make at this point, I believe, and probably could get a huge percentage of the country to agree with you. But that he has some sort of issue, which then leads us to speculation about this. Started a couple of months ago by one of the top allies for the president, Roger Stone. He said this before anyone else did. Listen.
They are going to claim that Donald Trump has Alzheimer's and that it is progressive and that is progressing and that is the source of his insanity. But under the 25th Amendment, if a majority of the cabinet plus the vice president agree that the president is incapacitated, well, then he is removed. And if he seeks to fight the charges, it goes to the US House of Representatives, where erosion among Republicans could destroy the Trump presidency. But this is the game plan. Watch carefully. You're going to see the word Alzheimer's more and more in the next several days.
I believe that was Roger Stone trying to plant a thought in people's heads. It didn't stick. Almost no one talked about Alzheimer's at that time or a couple of days later. But it is very interesting that it's his Trump side that's putting that out there. Look, I think a very solid theory as to how Trump resigns is they say, oh, well, he had a checkup and it turns out poor guy's got early stage Alzheimer's. He's gonna have to step down. Now, is he gonna do that because he's tired or that he's realized his opponents are correct, that he doesn't have the mental capacity for leadership? Of course not. No, they would do that as the beginning of a defense for the charges against them on the Russian collusion. Some of Trump's lawyers have represented mob characters who claimed insanity. That is the beginning of an insanity plea. Oh, please, please go in that direction. For the good of the country, for the good of the world. One, you'd resign from office. Two, we'd get to say we told you it was crazy. And three, it's not a defense that's gonna work. But it gives you a sense of how desperate they are. It's his side that starts it, but it then starts to snowball. In a hot mic moment, two senators were caught talking about Donald Trump. They said a lot of disparaging things, but they also touched on this issue. One was a Democrat, Jack Reed. The other one was a Republican, Susan Collins. Listen to this.
This is crazy. I mean, I don't say that lightly and as a kind of a goofy guy.
Well, look, there's a Republican senator saying he might be crazy. So it has begun. Now we go to Bob Corker, another Republican senator, a very respected one, a very right-wing one from the South, and nonetheless, he said this.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful.
Damn. That is a guy who in the past has not really criticized Trump. There's some Republicans who have. He was not in that group. For a guy that deeply right-wing to come out and say, our president, the head of the Republican Party, might not have the stability or the mental competence to be president, that should not be understated. That's a huge news event. That happened on Friday. So this is picking up steam. Jackie Spire, back on the Democratic side, tweeted out, POTUS is showing signs of erratic behavior and mental instability that place the country in grave danger. Time to invoke the 25th Amendment. That's a US congressperson saying that. When Adam Schiff was asked about it, now he's a person who's higher up in Democratic leadership in the House, he said, I don't think we're at a point of thinking about the 25th Amendment. Saying in the longer version of that interview, I can see why people are concerned. I can see why they're going in that direction, but basically saying not yet, which doesn't mean no, that's outrageous. No, we wouldn't think about it, just not quite yet. And by the way, Democrats, for all that they're supposed to oppose Trump, often are far more timid in opposing him than Republicans who are not on Trump's side. Whether it's Bob Corker, Susan Collins, or people like Jennifer Rubin, very, very conservative writer for the Washington Post, when asked in a podcast if Trump is racist, she said, absolutely. He basically sees the world in very simplistic terms, and he categorizes people based on race and other factors along those lines, which you shouldn't make decisions based on. So when the time comes and Trump needs Republicans, it appears that a lot of them are not going to be there for him, and we're just at the beginning of this process. Now, speaking of timid, the mainstream media is incredibly timid when it comes to these type of topics. Nonetheless, Brian Stelter, in a slightly awkward way, brought up this issue over the weekend on CNN's Reliable Sources. Let's watch.
Is the President of the United States a racist? Is he suffering from some kind of illness? Is he fit for office? And if he's unfit, then what? These are upsetting, polarizing questions. They're uncomfortable to ask. But we in the national news media can't pretend like our readers and viewers aren't already asking. They are asking. Is the President of the United States suffering from some sort of illness? Is he racist? Is he fit to be commander-in-chief? And one more. Is it time for objective journalists, and I don't mean opinion folks, I mean down-the-middle journalists, to address these questions head on? And if so, how in the world should they do that?
That's actually super simple. I like the overly dramatic reading of that, but but you just talk about them. I know why CNN is very, very reluctant to do that, because they're like, oh, we don't want to be called the liberal media. No, please. Now look, Bob Corker's talking about it. It's okay. And by the way, they wouldn't have brought it up if people like Bob Corker didn't give them permission to bring it up, in a sense. So, is the president racist? Look, we talked about that before. He clearly is. I mean, saying that he thinks the people who were protesting Nazis were just as culpable in saying that many sides, both sides do it. He called the counter protesters of Nazis very, very violent. He said there was very fine people on the Nazi side. Jesus Christ. Anyway, is he ill? Does he actually have Alzheimer's? I have no idea. I'm not his doctor. And by the way, his doctor doesn't know. Trump writes his own notes for the doctor. The doctor pretty much admitted that, goofball as he is. Is he unfit for office? Damn straight he is. That's not a hard conversation at all. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that you could use the 25th Amendment. I'm going to give you my thoughts on that in 1 second, but I want to get your thoughts. We're doing a poll, tytnetwork.com/25th, and the question is, should Trump be disqualified from the presidency for mental incompetence? I mean, it's a funny way of putting it, but that's pretty much literally what the 25th Amendment would do. Now, again, you need Pence and you need a majority of Congress. It's not an easy thing to do. Do I think they should do it? No. Look, the guy is horribly incompetent. I told you from day one and earlier than day one that his number one problem would not be the racism or his policies, it would be his grotesque incompetence. Why do you think I did a segment called Loser Donald, where I found you 100 examples of his incompetence before the election? Because I knew that that's his number one problem. But we knew that before we voted. So I don't think you should be able to replace a president just because he's monumentally dumb or you think he's monumentally offensive. So if there is a crime and Mueller finds evidence of it, warm up that impeachment machine. I'll be the first person in that parade. I think Trump is going to resign in disgrace anyway. He might even use this Alzheimer's defense that his buddy Roger Stone has set up for him. But in terms of pushing out a president because we don't like him, That's an undemocratic principle that I'm not in favor of, even with a monster like Donald Trump, even though he's clearly incompetent in every way, shape, or form. But the guy's not in a coma, and we have no idea if he actually has an illness. So I vote no, but that's how bad it's gotten that we're having that conversation. TYT membership gets you commercial-free Young Turks. Download it, stream it, podcast it, get all the network shows, and support independent media. TYTnetwork.com/join.